Welcome to Rev Reads. I am thrilled to have an author who I was unfamiliar with until I recently read his book, The Economics of the Parables, but we're talking to Reverend Robert Sirico. Reverend Sirico is the co-founder of the Acton Institute, which teaches about social and economic issues for the church, something that I think we're all in need of. And you can really see his depth on this issue through his book, Economic of the Parables. And so I just want to thank Robert Sirico for coming on to talk to us about economics in the parables for a few moments this morning.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So let's dive right in because there's a lot I want to talk about in the book. The first thing that sort of struck me when I was going through your book was how a book on economic lessons from parables seemed so obvious to me once I started reading it. Like, how do we not have a whole bunch of these books?
Yeah.
And then you wrote one finally. And so my question is, what was sort of the moment that made you say, I'm going to write a book on this? Because I think seems like an obvious topic, but nobody's done it before.
You're right. When I did the research on the book, I want to see if there were other things, other books that were written on this. And I've read a lot, obviously a biblical commentary as a preacher and a lot of economics, but there's one book from England, but it's a very different kind of book. It doesn't quite go into the depth that I attempted to here. There are some very good academic articles, some of which I cite in my book that deal with economic questions within the parables, but no book on it. And I guess it just came out of my preaching, incorporated with my work at the Acton Institute, or separate from that. But I have been a full-time pastor my whole clerical career. So I preached on all of the parables numerous times. And given my economic frame of reference, I saw these questions, but I was very careful not to, so to speak, politicize the pulpit, which I wish a lot of other people would do, not do. But then I just began to draw these connections and compile them over probably 10 years or more. And then, one of the benefits of COVID is I finally sat down and threw it all together. I had various research assistants at various times pull articles and references that I have a folder going through it, but that's kind of the origin of the book.
So I'd love if we could give the viewer a little taste of what your book is like. And so I'd like to just throw out the parable of the talents, probably maybe the most well-known of probably we'd say an economic themed parable. And just to put everybody in context, to remind them, this is where the landowner has 3 servants, gives them differing amounts of money, goes away for a time. 2 of them make profit based on the amount that they were given, and 1 hides it under the ground. And then the landowner responds positively to those who brought in profit and negatively to those who hid his money in the ground. And so I just wondered if, just based on that parable, you could just give us some nuggets that were found in your book, just some little insights that we could have on economics based off of the parable of the talents.
Well, let me begin also by prefacing the entirety of my approach is that this is not a kind of approach that says this is the economic teaching of the New Testament. I think that would be anomalous, because as a system of thought, as an academic system, economics doesn't emerge in history until much later, with the late scholastics, then with Adam Smith, and then later on. So I'm not saying Jesus was an Austrian economist. That's not the point of this book. What is striking is that it is a natural part of human existence to account for the reality of scarcity, which exists throughout the world in all cultures, and the necessity to allocate those resources appropriately. And what you find in the Gospels, and in this one in particular, the parable of the talents, which, by the way, the word talent comes from this gospel. The way we use it today comes from this gospel. It's a unit of economic measurement, but it comes into our usage, as so many passages in the Bible do, as a result of the teaching of Jesus. What struck me about this is the clearest thing that is striking to me is the attitude of the man who hides the talent. And we note here that he receives this talent and he doesn't lose it. He doesn't lose profit on it. He doesn't diminish it. He hides it. And when he's asked for an explanation, what is very revelatory to my mind is his attitude toward the master, his complete misconception of who the generous benefactor was. He says, the first thing he says is, I was afraid. This runs counter to the passages we see in the scripture so many times, be not afraid.
Yeah. So
So he distrusts the master from the outset. And then he says something that is completely incongruent with the master's personality. I knew that you were a man who reaps where you do not sow and gathers where you have not scattered. In saying this, he really sounds like Karl Marx. You know, he sounds like the whole accusation against a free economy, that any profit is exploitation. And that's what he's accusing the master of here. And so the master says, okay, then at least you could have left the money with the bankers and gotten a little profit out of it. But you hid it in the ground, which was a legitimate way of preserving your money, but not increasing it. And then, of course, and I think this is really striking too, is that the ones who receive the most get the most. And that can be understood in an economic way. But of course, the whole purpose of the parable and the parables is to point beyond the material. It's the occasion is to start with this material existence that we have and see how it throws light back upon the gospel of Christ, the transcendent call to salvation, to the kingdom of God, which is what the parables are all about.
Yeah, no, and so yeah, great insight there on that. I think my favorite chapter in the book was actually on the parable of the vineyard workers.
Yeah.
Because I think if any parable would be used to be against the free market, it would probably be that parable, because all the workers receive the same pay at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I had a priest once. I was in a seminar with a group of priests, and this priest got up and said, well, you've just misinterpreted the whole parable, because the parable is showing how wicked the owner is. Because really, the owner, you could use this parable, if you wanted to politicize it, as an anti-union rant, right? I mean,
oh yeah, totally, yeah.
It can be tugged either way. But I think what's interesting about it is, first of all, right now it's timely because it's ripped from the headlines, right? The labor shortage. And what happens here in this labor shortage, this man has this crop that has to be harvested. And if it's not harvested, it's wasted. And that has a deleterious effect, not only on the landowner, but also on all of those who depend upon the product that he's, harvesting. But what it also, to my mind, underscores is the subjective value of economic exchange. People who decry the owner of this vineyard say that he was unjust. That's in effect what the workers who work the entire day say, that he was unjust. But if you just tweak the gospel, the parable a little bit and say, well, what would have happened had he distributed the money and paid the full amount to those who worked the whole day that he agreed upon, and then half the amount for those who worked half the day, and a quarter of the amount for those who worked a quarter of the day? Everyone would have gone home happy, because I got what I agreed to. So the anger isn't about the question of injustice. The anger is what the vineyard owner points to at the end. Are you angry because are you envious because I am generous? Yeah. It's the generosity. And it has a parallel, at least this part of it has a parallel in the parable of the prodigal son, because the older son is envious, in effect, that the younger son is forgiven, that the father is being generous to the younger son. It's the reaction of people in church today when newcomers come and they don't quite look like the rest of us, and they haven't been in the church like we have toiling all. It's the thief on the cross, right? Who steals heaven. In effect, he does nothing. He just says, "Gee, remember me when you get into your kingdom." And it really underscores the generosity of God. When we stand before the throne of God in the final judgment, we're not going to demand justice. We'd be out of our minds to demand justice.
Oh, true. Yeah.
And this is the mercy that this master shows. And he really says it all very well. Was this not my property to do with as I wanted? Didn't we agree upon this wage? And he really gives us the ethic of that thing, which may sit uncomfortably. Again, it's not about economics. It's about the grace of God. We cannot earn heaven.
Yeah, and you make a good point in this chapter in particular, but I think you sprinkle it out in a couple other places about the importance for just having a sound functioning economy and also just healthy relationships between one another to allow laborers and owners, masters and servants, employers, employees, to be able to have a freeness in their negotiation to decide their wages and their pay. And I wonder if you could just touch on that a little bit about the importance of allowing employers and employees and so forth to be able to have freeness in the way that they make their agreements.
It's employers and employees. It's also buyers and sellers. That when we come upon an exchange of some sort, we are the ones who know best what is needed. As a seller, I know what I can let this product go for. And as a buyer, I know the priority of this in my life. We're all willing to pay more for the first glass of water on a desert than the 100th glass of water in a desert. And this is called the subjective theory of labor, of value, that when we go into a market, prices are not determined by some abstract thing, not determined by the amount of work. Marx basically said that the value of an object is the sweat and labor that goes into the production. But free market economists say, no, it's what the price of a thing doesn't exist objectively. It exists at the point of purchase. Yeah. That this is what people say. You can put a price tag on something, but that's not the price of the thing. And I think that's what's being assumed in this gospel. And what that also does, and I think this is a very important point, this free exchange allows for people to bring the most of their knowledge to bear on the exchange. In other words, to cut off that free exchange, to set a price ceiling or price floor, which is the temptation right now with gas prices, right?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
Really dislocates the entire economy because it fails to recognize that prices contain also information about the scarcity of the good that's being sold or its abundance, as the case may be.
I thought that was great in the book. I think the other thing that sort of maybe struck me right up at the top as far as the things that I enjoyed the most was you talked about this a few times too, about how one of the benefits of the free market is that the free market, more than any other economic system we have today, actually rewards people who serve the needs of others. And so I wonder if you could talk about that.
That's what profit is. It's a sign that you have served the needs of other people. You don't make a profit if you haven't met other people's needs. When people go into a free exchange, they both come out satisfied with it, or they wouldn't have gone into it in the first place. We do a little, we call it the free market game. You might try it in your church sometime if you want to teach a little economic literacy to kids. We have, let's say there are 10 students. We have 10 bags of something we've gotten from the dollar store. So we've paid $1 for each of these things. So it may be a pair of sunglasses or a barrette, a girl's hair clip, or a bottle of cheap perfume or hand sanitizer, or whatever it happens to be, Post-it notes, and you put them in these brown bags and you distribute them to different people, and they go and they look at their thing, and then they are told to trade. And so everybody opens the thing. Well, I don't think you're going to buy a hair clip for your hair, right? That's not going to have much value.
No,
to you.
no.
And you may have that in your bag. So you see some Post-it notes. I see a lot of books behind you. Post-it notes might come in handy. And so you're willing to exchange. And the girl with all the hair might want that. And at the end of the day, everybody comes out feeling wealthier, so to speak. So profits are a sign that you have served people, that you have gotten to them what they have desired and were willing to exchange for.
Yeah, no, that was a great insight, because I think so often we belittle profits today. We talk about how profits is a bad motive to have, but it actually, when you think about it, it shows that you're serving other people.
If it's free. If it's free exchange, you could have profits from a drug trade or robbing somebody in the back alley. You know, you get a profit from that.
Yeah.
But when it's free, when people come to it, then it may not even be moral, but at least people are enriched by it.
I think John Stossel talked about that in one of his books, about how you see it illustrated whenever you have a buyer and seller both say thank you at the end of the transaction. Yeah. Anytime you can have that, that's when you know you made out good handing your money over. The person who's selling made out good receiving your money, and you made out good because you received their good. And so when you can both say thank you, that's the ideal type of transaction.
Exactly.
In the parable of the two debtors, you talked about forgiveness and debt a little bit. Yeah. And you talked about the importance of the debt still being owed in that parable. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about just how we view debt in the economic world and how that impacts even the way that we view the forgiveness of Christ, in the way that he forgives debts that we have.
Well, yeah, I think if we're talking about it on an economic plane, a lot of people resent the lender because they need the money and they don't really want to have to pay it back. And so they resent the lender. But the lender really is, in essence, a benefactor. It's one who makes possible something for us that we would not have access to in another way. And that the other thing is that's underscored in this parable is that generosity is not, the reception of generosity is not a right. We should be grateful for it and prove ourselves worthy of it. And again, here's the economic throwing back light onto the gospel of Christ, because that's precisely the situation we stand before God in. We owe something to God by virtue of our creation. The greatest act of beneficence is our creation, is our very existence. And the fact then on top of that, that we would sin against this benefactor is horrendous. In this particular parable, you see the generosity of the benefactor, the king who loans the money, in a magnanimous way toward the first man, who then doesn't pass that on. You know, we have this phrase now, paying it forward. This guy had a great opportunity to pay that forward. And his parsimoniousness, his anger, his self-righteousness shows a great deal of, or let me say, a profound lack of self-consciousness. And it's arrogance, really.
Yeah. And so you just had a wonderful moment in that parable when you talked about the universality of Christ's forgiveness and about how he freely offers forgiveness to all. And we lose sight of the depths of what Christ does in forgiving our debt when we begin to live in an economic sphere where we think debts don't need to be repaid, because then we don't understand what it is, the greatness that Christ offers us in forgiving our sin debt. And I thought that was a great theological point.
We're seeing it right now in the whole discussion over the forgiveness of school debt, educational loans. and the complexity of that. You think, well, just forgive it for somebody. But what about everybody else who's already paid the debt? And the other thing on a pastoral level, just as a pastor, when somebody's come to confession, whether it's sacramental or in a counseling situation, I try and impress upon them the appreciation of God's gracious forgiveness and the necessity for them to then extend that to others. You've been enriched right now. You've been forgiven of a great burden. You can afford to be generous as you leave here.
Yeah. And one of the things I loved about the book, and that I want to make sure everybody knows if you do pick it up to read it, is that it is 10 chapters on the parables, and 13. Then follow
13. Baker's
13? 13. Okay. So you cover 13 parables, but then there's an afterword that's about 40 pages. Yeah. And that's pretty crucial in my view, the afterword. And so that's just as important, because one thing you cover in the afterword is, to me, the two passages in the Bible. You cover much more than that, but for me, what stood out were two in particular that I think would be used by the most people to say the economic lessons that Reverend Sirico brings out. They don't jive, because we know that Jesus hates markets, and the free market specifically because he drove out the money changers, and because the disciples the church shared everything in common in Acts. And I was wondering if you could hit on those as sort of our conclusion on why Jesus driving out the money changers and Acts 4 are not signs that we need to have a socialist non-market economy.
Well, first of all, the primitive socialism in the Acts of the Apostles, that's what Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels said about they had all things common, is a complete misnomer. It shows that you haven't read the whole text, because first of all, it's not normative. This is an emergency situation. It's a particular situation at the beginning of the church's existence. And under persecution, of course, people will, in emergency circumstances, exchange or share things. But that's the other thing. It's sharing. It's not a coerced thing. It's not demanded. And if you think that's me reading it into the text, then I suggest you read the encounter that Peter has with Ananias and Sapphira, who sell their property, take some of it out, and then give it to Peter. And he says explicitly, when you own the property, was it not your own? And after you sold it, did it not remain your own? So the problem wasn't that they didn't give, it's that they lied. Yeah. And that's what brought their condemnation. So I don't see how it's tenable to say that this is the normative thing. It also confuses the sharing of Christianity, the sharing that goes on in Christianity, with the coercive redistribution of wealth that goes on into socialism. And in that passage, I think is that passage where I quote Churchill, who says that the primitive Christianity said the socialism of early Christianity said, all that I have is yours. But modern socialism says, all that you have is mine. Yeah. And it's the complete reversal of the whole moral point. Now, the money changes in the temple can get very complicated. It was fascinating. I learned a lot researching that section. But the first thing you need to know is that it wasn't some kind of profanation of money in the temple. The exchange went on in the court of the Gentiles, and it was the place where you would exchange these shekels. They weren't shekels exactly. They were pagan images on coins for temple money, so that you wouldn't bring these pagan images into the temple. And it really provided a service because it enabled people to purchase the various things that they needed for sacrifice. It was completely a legitimate exchange that had gone on in front of Jesus since he was a child. The problem was that these people were distorting the exchange rates. They were putting their finger on the scale and making this whole thing an opportunity for exploitation precisely at the moment that people were coming in to worship God. It really is pointing to the transcendence, to the eschatological kingdom of God, and not to some kind of Marxist class struggle that one commentator who I cite in the book tries to make it sound like.
Yeah. No, great insight, great response to that. And so we're up for our time, but I just want to thank again Reverend Sirico. I cannot recommend this book any more highly to someone who wants to learn about economic principles in the Bible. I think he is balanced throughout as far as not pulling out illegitimate teachings on economics. I think it's in line with that. There's also some wonderful spiritual insights that are going to go the direction that Jesus intended it to go, with using the economics to teach spiritual insights. So
the King James Bible.
and he uses the King James text. So
the majesty of the King James. I was an English major, and I love the majesty of that language. Besides which, I heard it as a kid in the black churches that I used to go attend in Brooklyn.
So again, if you haven't picked up a copy, grab a copy of it. I highly recommend it. And if you've enjoyed this interview and you want to subscribe to the channel, I would love for you to be a part of our community here at Rev Reads. And I hope you have a great day. And again, the book is The Economics of the Parable by Reverend Robert Sirico.